Hello there, friends. Welcome back to another episode of Generation Tech. My name is Alan. The Clone Trooper is no doubt one of the most effective infantry fighters in galactic history. A lot of this has to do with the fact that they are genetically modified for war and trained from birth in the art of combat. Now, what makes the average clone trooper such an elite warrior isn't just their capabilities and what they are doing, but it's what they're not doing. Let me explain. Take a look at the 61st Mobile Infantry, also known as Twilight Company. They are one of the most famous rebel infantry units of the Galactic Civil War. The 61st served bravely in the vanguard of the Mid-Rim offensive and retreat, and since they were always on the spear tip, they oftentimes found themselves cut off from rebel logistics and supplies. As such, the basic squaddies of the 61st had to not only fight in constant skirmishes against the Imperial forces, they also took turns taking care of things that usually support personnel would take care of, like going out on missions to forage for food, fuel, and supplies, and also holding open tryouts for recruiting, new people into their unit. Usually this would happen after they liberated a city. This is really a heroic effort, a testament to the leadership of the 61st and the quality of the average soldier in their ranks. Somehow they were able to survive the war doing this. But the combat effectiveness of this unit was severely affected by the lack of support soldiers. By my estimates, I think for every one frontline soldier they had only one personnel supporting them. And these individuals were mostly crewing the unit's transport ships. A 1-to-1 tooth-to-tail ratio is really not ideal, especially if you're fighting in a conflict in a massive galaxy hopping from system to system. Now, if we take a look at our own history, the United States military, despite fielding a relatively inexperienced force from World War II, had one of the most complicated and robust logistical and support networks on the planet, and this is probably why the Allies won the war, and why it was silly for Germany and Japan to even attempt to take over the world. The United States gave weapons, munitions, and food to everyone who was willing to fight: Brits, Russians, Chinese partisans. And throughout the conflict, for every American soldier that was deployed on the front line, there were usually 2 to 3 support personnel working behind the scenes to keep them fed, armed, and clothed. During larger operations like the invasion of Normandy, or just more complicated operations like the island hopping campaigns in the Pacific, that number got closer to 4 to 5 support personnel for every soldier. This is pretty much unheard of and marked the beginning of modern warfare. Logistics were always important. They won or lost battles, but now they were everything. And now in modern times in the US military, the tooth-to-tail ratio is somewhere around 6 to 9 support soldiers for every 1 frontline combatant. So that has expanded immensely. Even the US military needs its own IT support and cybersecurity experts, and now, anti-drone specialists. These type of support personnel have grown increasingly important in our modern networked battlefield. The clone army, like the US military, places a huge amount of investment into its average frontline fighter. I mean, the GAR spent 9 years growing and training these men. Today we're going to be taking a look at the lesser known individuals, the support staff that actually keep this entire operation functional and, keep the average clone trooper well fed so that they're able to fight at maximum strength. The specialists are clone troopers who technically aren't considered frontline infantry fighters. They usually are focused on a specific set of skills for a certain type of mission they have to perform. But because most of these individuals do find themselves close to the front lines and occasionally are caught in enemy fire, they are also trained to be combat soldiers, mostly. Amongst the most important of these support units were clone medics. Like all clones, clone medics received specialized training in Kamino and were given an intimate knowledge not only of human physiology, but a deep and intimate understanding of the Fett clones, who are all genetically identical. Clone medics can be identified by the large red cross on their shoulder pauldron and the large medical backpack that they carry into battle. Clone medics are generally deployed at the Legion level and have far more gear and expertise, and are able to perform advanced procedures in the field that can stabilize even the worst injuries. Clone medics usually have a variety of different surgical tools in their backpack, like vibro scalpels, laser scalpels, cauterizers, using lasers to close wounds, and a variety of different bandages, and of course Bacta products for healing. This is a terrific way for the Republic to protect the investment they made into these clone troopers, who were, pretty resilient. All you had to do was plug their holes when they got injured, and they usually recovered pretty quickly. These medics were typically deployed with the DC-15 carbine or just a sidearm for personal protection. Next up, we have the Clone Combat Engineer. You can identify these guys usually by the wild look in their eyes, and I do believe they are all somewhat related to Clone Trooper Wrecker, the mutant Bad Batcher. He's a fine example of this type of clone specimen. Although the Clone Combat Engineers were mostly used to maintain the JAR's vehicle pool while in the field, they were also occasionally allowed to blow things up. During the initial invasion of Ryloth by Separatist forces, a small team of clone combat engineers led by Jedi Master Ima Gun D managed to rig a LAAT to explode, which closed down a key narrow passage the unit was traveling through. This would significantly change the battlefield they were preparing. By closing down one of the avenues of approach for enemy forces, Ima Gun D and his small unit of clone troopers were able to make a last stand and protect a group of Twi'lek refugees led by future Twi'lek partisan Cham Syndulla. They were able to escape the battle and live and fight another day. Sometimes all you need is a few clone engineers and some explosives, and you can blast your way to changing galactic history. Then we have the even crazier cousin of the combat engineer, the Ordnance Specialist. You can recognize them by their bright orange Phase 1 clone trooper armor. Sure, Phase 1 armor isn't as comfortable as Phase 2 armor, but it can be completely sealed from environmental hazards like poisons and chemicals and all sorts of weird types of weapons that the Separatists would deploy against the clones. The Clone Ordnance Specialists were deployed at the clone battalion level and were chosen because of their extremely steady nerves and steady hands. Next up, we have the Clone Military Police, otherwise known as the Clone Shock Troopers. You can identify them by their red armor and much more serious demeanor. Unlike the normal rank-and-file clones who were all bred on Kamino, the Clone Shock Troopers were secretly produced for Palpatine in facilities on Coruscant. They were basically Palpatine's own private army, built to enforce his will. But the official reason for the existence of this unit was to provide security as the Coruscant Home Guard and keep unruly clones on shore leave in line as they visited Coruscant's many fine drinking establishments. Regular clones didn't really trust or relate to these shock troopers, not only because they weren't born and raised on Kamino, but also because of incidents like the shooting of ARC Trooper 5s, a beloved trooper of the 501st. I guess there's always going to be some tension between the rank and file and the military police, no matter what galaxy you're in. Lastly, we have Clone Commandos and Forward Observers. Clone Commandos typically deployed in 4-man teams and were involved in direct action operations behind enemy lines, where you need stealth and heavy firepower to get the job done. Although sometimes these Clone Commandos would also be deployed with regular clone units who would work as a security force or cordon force. But generally, when you deploy a Clone Commando unit, you're basically saving an entire battalion of clones from getting involved in some really hairy business. As such, the Clone Commandos are seen as like the big brothers of your rank and file clone troopers. People definitely looked up to these guys because of their capabilities. Forward Observers were specialized clones who brought the full might of the Republic Navy's firepower into play, and this was especially important because, again, the clones were usually outnumbered. Oftentimes deployed with regular clone units, these individuals helped level the playing field against the droid army. No one ever really wants to lug around a heavy radio in combat, but I can assure you, people really do respect the individuals who do this, because if you're ever stuck in a bad situation, these guys are your best way out of that situation. The Republic was completely outnumbered in the opening days of the Clone Wars. This meant that they had to use force multipliers like combined arms tactics and advanced weapon systems, along with just great training and discipline, to overcome a numerically superior enemy force. But the most important tool that a smaller force can use against a larger force is mobility. Being bogged down when your enemy has almost infinite amount of clankers that they can deploy against you is literally a death sentence. The Republic Navy plays a huge role in making sure that the average clone trooper makes it safely into system and then to the ground, where they can actually deploy their training. We just did an in-depth video about the Acclamator class assault ship and the complex operation it takes to get one of these ships safely to the surface. The Republic Navy is mainly staffed by clone troopers who are usually selected early on in their training for service in the Navy. Similar to the Imperial Navy, a clone cadet can take the route of becoming a crew member on a capital ship. At the highest rank, we have clone navigation officers who fill the bridge as officers and sometimes are even placed in command positions. Clones also staff the various gun positions and weapons emplacements on board. They also worked as maintenance crews, keeping starfighter complements fueled, repaired, and ready at a moment's notice to support any ground units in desperate need for fire support. You also had clones running the engineering department and keeping the central reactor running at peak efficiency. The entire Navy, from the largest dreadnought to the smallest corvettes, are staffed and manned mainly by clones. Yes, you have judicial forces, planetary defense force officers, and Jedi, but they really do make up a small percentage of the overall population. Clone cadets could also take the route to becoming a pilot. The ones with the fastest reflexes were generally assigned to starfighter units that provided escort for the larger low-altitude assault transports, which were also crewed by clones. You typically had 2 pilots on one of these birds, a crew chief, and multiple gunners. The LAAT was especially loved by the clones because the appearance of one of these things usually meant that you were either going home or getting reinforced with more troops, more weapons, more munitions, or if you're really lucky, a Walker tank. The Y-Wing was also another favorite amongst frontline units. These slow-moving bombers were capable of taking out entire formations of enemy fighters with an assortment of lethal and also non-lethal options, like massive EMP bombs that only really damage electronics and keep organics relatively safe. This is a really good option for, again, close air support. And then we have ground vehicles like the All-Terrain Tactical Enforcer, which is kind of part IFV, part mobile fire support, part home on longer operations. The pilot of one of these walkers is expected to be as flexible as the unit's capabilities, which include walking up vertical cliff faces and even deploying in space. And so it wasn't just the clone infantry's capabilities that gave them the huge edge against the Separatist droid army, it was also their pilots and drivers that really made this force potent. Logistics for the Grand Army of the Republic was many times more complicated than it was for the Confederacy of Invented Systems. And that's because droids were basically plug and play. You just have to remember to charge them before you go to sleep, like an iPhone. Now, initially, most of the logistics for the clone army stem from Kamino, where you had, a lot of stored material to keep these kind of units operational. The Kaminoans designed the arm of the Clones War. They subcontracted the small arms and munitions providers. They also processed the food and carefully balanced the clones' diets. This is, after all, a culture that survived a cataclysmic natural disaster that basically destroyed a huge percentage of their population. The only way they were able to survive was through extreme food rationing and genetic modification. Now, initially, larger vessels like the Acclimator-class assault ship were used for transportation of war material. But eventually, you had an army of freighters run either by civilians or by the military to basically support the logistical needs of the Grand Army of the Republic. Given the chaotic nature of the war, which included a constantly shifting front line and multiple hotspots, the Republic developed fortress worlds and supply depots that were heavily guarded, and they typically wanted Acclimators and Venator-class Star Destroyers to visit these places to resupply. These facilities were run by clone quartermasters and clone supply troopers who were extremely important to the war effort. You also have specialized fuel teams and dangerous ordnance transport teams that, again, dealt with volatile kind of things. So this is a job that is, pretty dangerous, maybe as dangerous as what the frontline troops went through, but again, you're not going to have any glory or find any glory by doing this type of job. One of the earlier operations carried out by the Republic during the Clone Wars was an attempt to secure a rite of passage through Hutt space. The goal was ultimately to create supply lines through Hutt space and build a massive resupply depot there that would really cut the time it would take for a Venator-class Star Destroyer to make it to a depot so that it could resupply. Alongside the logistics team, you also had a small but equally as important group of clones who maintained the galaxy's communication networks. During the Separatist crisis, one of the first things that the Separatists hijacked was the Holonet. They used it to broadcast their own propaganda. As the war progressed, maintaining this network of Holonet nodes and transmission points were essential in keeping the Republic ahead of their Separatist counterparts. Remember, communications are still energy waves, and you still have to beam those at FTL if you actually want to communicate with someone in, relatively real time. You also had special teams devoted to encryption and decryption of communications. There are also teams dedicated to mapping out new hyperspace lanes and maintaining maps so that all of this information was up to date. These maps were extremely important for the strategic command staff, which was usually led by a Jedi and also assisted by dozens of clone officers and aides. Now, we're really just scratching the surface here. There are actually tons and tons of more support staff that I probably didn't think about. It's unknown how many clones actually support your average clone trooper in the field, but judging by how our world works and then looking at the Star Wars galaxy and the mission of the Galactic Republic, which was securing multiple planets all across the galaxy, I can imagine this is a very challenging and costly thing to do. And although droids and automation does decrease manpower needs somewhat, I wouldn't be surprised if for every clone trooper, there were as many as 10 clone support personnel behind it. So there you have it, guys. Being support personnel might not be as sexy as being a frontline soldier, but these clones were definitely crucial to the entire war effort. I hope you guys enjoyed today's video. Don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification button down below so you don't miss on the rest of awesome content. As usual, my name is Alan, reminding you that my allegiance is to the Republic, to democracy. I'll see you next time.